So welcome, Derek Weeks, to the podcast. So, Derek, do you want to introduce yourself? And we've actually known each other probably close for 15 years, back
Yeah,
in the HP days. So,
y-
you want to tell
you're
us a little
aging us. You're aging us right away.
about
No, we haven't
industry,
been around that long.
you know?
Well, Colin, it's absolutely good to be here. It's good to see you as always, and I'm glad our careers have allowed us to intersect over the years. It's always been a good opportunity. So, right now I'm vice president at Sonatype. I've been at Sonatype for the last 7 years. And at Sonatype, I lead a lot of different efforts. One is building our community of developers, DevOps pros, and cybersecurity pros. Um, and I also lead a couple of our state of the industry reports or industry reports. One is the software supply chain report, which I have championed for 7 years now. We're starting to outline and write our seventh annual version of that. I also lead our DevSecOps community survey efforts, which I've led also 6 or 7 years now. So leading a lot of research that goes out and helps inform the community at large and market at large, kind of what's happening in software developments, most specifically around how open source components, libraries are being used in software development, how that impacts both cybersecurity from positives and negatives, how that impacts and makes development more efficient or introduces more risks, et cetera. In addition to the work at Sonatype, I've also 5 years ago co-founded a conference called All Day DevOps, the largest DevOps conference in the world in the DevOps industry. We attract over 30,000 people a year to that conference. And as part of that conference, we have a variety of different tracks from CI/CD to DevSecOps to modern and cloud infrastructure to site reliability engineering, among other things. So it attracts a great community where we have a lot of conversations and exchanges and share knowledge, and it's just been a fun part of things to do over the years.
Yeah, your report that you do every year is really scary reading. So it's going to be, it's like, yeah, all of the bad information and bad libraries that people continually download and use. Do you actually ever see that getting better? Because it just seems like every year the news seems worse and worse about the number of malicious downloads that are happening, and we never seem to be turning the curve on actually getting better at improving our software supply.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it's kind of funny when you say it's kind of scary. So the number of people that I've heard say, "Derek, you're scaring me," is feels like it happens at least every week when I share some information about what's going on. But first of all, that's the reason that I started the report in the first place. Is we had access, still have access to a whole bunch of data about what's happening in software development, cybersecurity at Sonatype. And this report that I produce is not a vendor-specific report. We don't talk about our products or anything. It's just what's happening globally in software development, where I can look at 15,000 different software development organizations and see what they're doing and collaborate with others in the industry on this data. And part of the scary things that are happening out there is, we see billions upon billion. In fact, in 2020, we saw 1.5 trillion downloads of open source components across Java, JavaScript, Ruby, Python, as well as containers downloads in the industry. 1.5 trillion. So just take the number of people in software development. If on the high end, that's 30 or 35 million people in development that are responsible for 1.2 trillion downloads or 1.5 trillion downloads of stuff. There's a huge amount of stuff being consumed. And depending on the development languages or container stacks that people are using, anywhere between 10 and 40% of what's being downloaded has known vulnerabilities in it. So people hear this and they're like, oh my gosh, that's really not good practice. I hope it's not me. And what I see year after year, I just ran the current numbers for 2020, and we've been in Java specifically, we've been sitting around 10% of what's downloaded has a known security vulnerability in it, from any organization worldwide. So pick any company that you know developing software, whether you believe they're a high-tech company or they're a bank that is building its own software. 10% of what all those organizations are downloading have vulnerabilities from the start. Now, the balance of this is, and the kind of bad news, in our annual survey, we saw last year 1 in 5 organizations had a breach related to vulnerable open source components. 1 in 5 organizations having a breach is not good, but that's down from 30. I think the high was 31%. That we saw back in 2018. That was shortly after the Equifax breach, which was the biggest open source related breach out there.
I remember that one. Right.
So, when you decrease from 30% to 20%, there's investment being made to make that kind of breach a lot harder. But when you talk about scary, the adversaries out there understand and see, well, people are getting better. They're not perfect, but they're getting better at using better, more secure open source. So let me shift my tactic elsewhere. And that's what's really scary about what's happening now in software supply chains is adversaries are saying, I'm going to go and find an open source project that has 100,000 downloads a week, and I'm going to start contributing code to that. And one day I'm going to contribute malicious code, or a backdoor into that, or a cryptocurrency miner, or something like that, and then have that downloaded by developers 100,000 times a week. And by the way, no one else working on this open source project team has cybersecurity experience to know that the code I committed was vulnerable or it had that backdoor. No one's sophisticated enough to see the things that I'm talented at doing as an adversary. And that's where the really scary stuff is coming in now, because there's very, very little that's commercially available to help prevent against that kind of thing. If you're running a bank or a technology company, you're at high risk from those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think especially since just about everybody's using open source, whether they think they are or not. It gets into some of the arguments about, well, this is why we should have a vendor product, because the malicious actors can't get in. But then the trouble is, you turn around and you look at the vendor products, and they're all using open source anyway. So you still always have that problem, whether it's open source or closed source. Do you think it's going to get worse, or do you think some of the tools are going to catch up with that kind of behavior and start to be able to monitor for that kind of bad code? I think it's probably extremely difficult, but you think the vendor is going to take a crack at that?
Absolutely. Sonatype's taking a crack at it, and I imagine that there are other vendors in the market that one that we know of, and probably a number of others that we don't yet know of, that are small inkling startups that have an idea that there's a problem out there in a growing problem. I think that we're in the technology industry, and the great thing about the technology industry that we've seen for our entire careers is the innovation is continuous. So as adversaries, when we look at adversaries saying, well, I used to attack the network, but then the network became more fortified because people invested in network security. So I can't go there. So now I'm going to shift into the applications, and then more investment happened there with static analysis and dynamic analysis. And the adversary shifted to say, well, I'm going to look at software development and how that is, how developers are using open source. I'm going to find vulnerabilities there. They're also looking, in the cases of SolarWinds, they're looking at the development tooling, perhaps in the development tool chain, and maybe I attack there because it's underinvested in terms of the cybersecurity protections at those layers. And the closer you are to the applications, the closer you are to the data, and the data is what people are trying to access anywhere through these breaches, really, unless it's a denial of service kind of attack. But as the adversaries are shifting their strategies, the market is responding to that. And where there's enough influence by the adversaries being successful at so many breaches, there will be more and more investment. And in fact, not only like the established companies go out and say, I want to bring new product to market in this space, but you have venture capitalists and private equity firms that are saying, oh my gosh, SolarWinds was just attacked through their development tool chain and development. Like, what is out there in the market that can prevent against this? And they go out and look and they say, well, there's nothing that can prevent against that. Maybe I should invest in people that I know in the technology field, like go and find some CEO that wants to leave his company, be another founder of a new company, has an idea, or I'm going to go out and invest in this kind of inkling startup that might have two people with an idea that says I can protect that supply chain and I can get a good return on that investment coming in, right? Because you have every board of directors now at every public company, or even perhaps some smaller tech software development companies, saying, how do we not become the next SolarWinds? And the board's looking at the CIO or the CTO or the CISO and saying, what's your answer? And if the CISO says, like, there's nothing in the market there to protect against that, there can be a huge demand from that kind of thing. So I think there's always this kind of race between what the adversaries are doing and what kind of investments are being made in the market, but it really drives that response. And just to add, like, for example, prior to the Equifax breach, in the open source software component security market, there was Sonatype and there was Black Duck, who's now owned by Synopsys. But after the Equifax breach, there might have been very tiny companies like a Sneak or a White Source Software out there that were doing this, that all of a sudden had a flood of new investment coming in and attention from the market. Like, they were trying to find customers before Equifax, but when every board out there is saying, how do we not become the next Equifax, you see this flood of investment coming in from venture capital, private equity, and also the corporations saying, I don't want to be sitting at the board table saying, yeah, we got breached the same way Equifax got breached because we didn't have a response internally ourselves to investigate and evaluate our approaches. So I think there's always that race that will be constantly there in the tech sector.
I think that the Equifax breach was certainly a turning point. Talking to a lot of companies about the focus on the software supply chain management. I think we were talking about it before, and there was always a lot of nods, and then we don't have time to do this, or it's not that urgent. After the Equifax, it was, I think, the high-level executives. No one wanted to say, well, you're just like Equifax, or you don't want to be another Equifax. So I think that was a huge turning point for the whole industry and the focus on that. So I think overall, although it was very bad for Equifax, I think it's allowed, it's raised the visibility at to the board level, and sometimes that's where you need further investment for companies. Otherwise, you get into just doing good old software development and not worrying about some of these vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Pressure on delivering, products and solutions, sometimes outweighed, right, the risk of the vulnerability.
Yeah. And to give you a sense of like the adversary behavior, I talked about post Equifax breach, the open source related breaches by organization went down from 31% to 21% over a 3-year period. So that's significant progress made from investment in enterprises to prevent that kind of attack. So I talked about the adversaries shifting their focus to contributing to open source projects and contributing malicious code or counterfeit components, what have you. So from 2015 to 2019, from 2015 to June 2019, we saw about 200 of those kinds of attacks, right? So it wasn't, in the grand scheme of things, 200 is not that large. From June 2019 to June 2020, we saw 900 more attacks, right? So that says the adversaries were trying to figure out, if you're making it harder for me in one place, where can I go that's easier? And they found easier, and the number of breaches, not the number of breaches, the number of this style of attack went up fourfold. From a 4-year period compared to a 1-year period, it was up fourfold in that time. So the adversaries are saying, this is my new attack vector, and that's what industry is going to figure out how to help try and identify and prevent.
Yeah, and some of the other issues are people just creating duplicate libraries and doing typo squatting on similar names. And I think that's especially with NPN, right? Just the way that their structure. You probably don't see it nearly as much with Maven Central. So do you think?
Well, we just saw it, in fact, in January. So there were a couple of components. We wrote a blog on this, but there were a couple of components that, based on what we wrote up in the blog, I think in a 2-week period at the end of December, beginning of January, the real components, not counterfeit ones, had 26 million downloads in that 2-week period. Now, someone went through and committed new components that shared a similar part of the name to the real components. So it was basically like you're Gucci and you're producing handbags, and someone else has introduced Gucci handbags on the market. Now, Gucci handbags manufactured by Gucci are one thing. Gucci handbags manufactured by Joe Bob's company are different, but they both say Gucci handbags, and they both look the same. So when these things are coming out with similar names or identical names, at least in part of it, we call it brand jacking. But those components were out on Maven Central for a couple of weeks for Java developers to download. And there were only a couple hundred downloads during that point compared to 26 million of the real components. But if you're an adversary and you say, oh my gosh, somehow 800 people somewhere downloaded this, that's my attack vector. And I'm the guy that created it, and I know where those things went. So I can track them down and exploit them, right? So that's a pretty efficient path if you're an adversary, but something that from a software supply chain perspective, you really need to be aware of. What are you consuming, and is it real?
Yeah, and it's not just worrying about getting hacked, but it's also about people stealing your resources, right? Quite a bit with the crypto mining libraries that people would end up downloading, and even though it might not actually be a vulnerability, that's still taking up your electricity, right? So we saw that quite a bit, and I think that people saw that as a very low risk approach, because you're not actually hacking into a system, it's actually people pulling it, and then you just sit there and wait for the money to roll in, or the bitcoins to roll in. Do you think more people will start to take that type of approach versus moving away from hacking, but trying to get you to do work in some form of another, and basically take up your resources? Do you think that's going to be much more of an attack vector in the future?
I don't see why. If Bitcoin is whatever, I don't check it or follow it daily, but I know Bitcoins are around $30,000 a piece now.
Right.
So when they were $9,000 a piece and you need a certain amount of computing power to produce one, there's a payoff. When, a year later, they're $30,000 a piece. If you can find someone's computing power to help you create a Bitcoin, you're absolutely going to go after it. And if people aren't paying attention, to those opportunities, I don't see why it wouldn't. And there's so much computing power out there that is coming online every day. The growth in AWS, the growth in Google Cloud, the growth in Azure being used out there, and people that are using that. I don't think there's many organizations out there that haven't gotten a surprise bill from AWS or Google Cloud or Azure that they're like, this is all cool, we're moving to the cloud. Oh my gosh, it's costing what?
Yeah.
That if there was fine-grained visibility into what was happening in those environments, it would be harder to get a surprise bill, but there's a lot of newness there and people getting used to what's there. So the opportunity for an adversary to inject malicious code that is a crypto miner is not out of the question. I remember it's probably 3 years ago, one of those kind of crypto miner malicious injections was happening with Jenkins X application. And I went out on Shodan and I looked for how many instances of Jenkins X were out there publicly facing, on the public faced internet versions of Jenkins X, and it was like 26,000. I just sat down and like, okay, where are they? Shodan says they're 26,000. I'm like, okay, how many of those have admin password as the access point, on them to allow me to get in?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's opportunity, and the adversaries it's not that sophisticated for the adversaries to do this kind of thing. It's just,
yeah, it's easy, so they follow the easy path, right?
yeah.
So you've been a road warrior for as long as I've known you.
Yes.
With COVID, you were just talking about, it's 11 months since
Yeah.
COVID hit, and so your travel probably went to a screeching zero.
Zero.
It's
That's right.
not much point going visiting customers because we're all at home, right? So
Yeah.
how has that impacted you as somebody who's really expected to be on the road? Well, 55 weeks a year, right?
Yeah.
Right. You don't
Well,
really ever.
my United account tells me in my lifetime I've traveled 1.3 million miles on their airline, so I know I've been on the road a lot. In the last year or 11 months, I've traveled none. I haven't been on an airplane or been to an airport, but I think um, the the thing that I think we all found obvious is we can work from home. We're 11 months into this. Our businesses are still in business. We're still working. We still have, schedules where I'm in 10 meetings today, and we're getting work done. So I think that in many cases through this 11 months, I've kind of looked at, boy, we're like right time, right place, that we have Zoom, we all have phones, we all have cameras on our computers that allow for conversations. We all, in many cases, at Sonatype, we have 350 employees or so. And prior to the pandemic, at least 250 of those were full-time remote anyway. So the impact on them has been zero with the pandemic because they were working at home. They're still working at home unless they have family that's now like, you were working at home, but you didn't have two kids in the background
Right.
during the day. So
Yeah,
that,
it's interesting where I am because we were expected to be in the office 5 days a week, and it was fascinating because I just joined the clearinghouse when it started to hit. Actually, I came back from a ski trip in Colorado, a backcountry ski trip, and the next day they said, well, everyone's going to try working from home. We don't know if the underlying infrastructure is going to work. We're all kind of die. We don't know where the breakpoints are going to be, all that kind of stuff. And we basically, everybody worked from home the next day. It was successful. And they said, well, given that this is getting worse and worse, why don't we try it for a week? And then it just, has turned into a 11-month exercise.
Right.
It's fascinating. It's probably like a lot of companies where we're saying, well, we don't really need to have everybody in office. Probably sometimes it's good to have people in office for collaboration sessions. But now we're kind of changing the policy to say, okay, we're just about out of room in New York. So yeah, if you want to still hire people in New York, we might have to implement a desk sharing or people working from home a lot more, that kind of concept. So you probably have talking to a lot of companies. Do you see other companies having that shift, and what's the impact on the collaboration tools? Where everyone jumped on Zoom or Teams or Cisco's WebEx or whatever solution. Do you think other solutions are going to show up in the marketplace to help with this collaboration?
Yeah, I certainly wish more would show up, and maybe there are more, and there are different kind of forms of doing that showing up. I mean, the one thing, and I don't know exactly how different it is from a collaboration perspective, but you have Zoom. You also have Slack, which is very asynchronous, often communications. Like I'm going out to industry groups and asking a question, but it might be tonight or tomorrow before anyone answers that. Then you have things like Clubhouse that are coming out that are, a audio chat application where people can gather and have conversations on a variety of different topics that you can kind of do from anywhere because you don't have to be on video. You can mute or unmute yourself or raise your hand on those. Clubhouse is not yet open to the general public, but I got access to it, in fact, earlier this week. The number of conversations that are happening there, and the number of topics that are happening there, and the number of industries, and the number of people globally. It's not a bunch of people in Silicon Valley that are like just in the Bay Area having a conversation. It's literally people all over the world of all different backgrounds in all different specialty area discussion groups that are happening. I think the one thing that many of us are missing is, Zoom provides this collaboration of voice and seeing people's faces, but like I'm desperately wanting a whiteboard, right, to sketch things out with people. And, unless I missed it, Zoom doesn't have that. And, there are things like Miro that we use to kind of sketch things out, but it's just not give me the pen and the, whiteboard pen and sketch things out and erase things and make it that fluid that aren't there yet. And like you said, when it comes to planning and collaboration, like the whiteboard was key. It allowed you to sketch out ideas.
Yeah, in my office, I actually had the walls painted with the whiteboard paint. I had the Federal Reserve as well. And it was great because you could get a bunch of people, could all sit around a wall, right? And very quickly diagram things together. And there are tools like Miro and things like that, but it's it takes a while to get used to it, and it just doesn't feel quite the same as everybody staring at a wall. And especially with hand drawing, you can actually do things pretty fast. My writing was never the best, but everyone, you get the point across. And then, but what was nice is other people would then walk into my office, and then we'd start discussions. And then,
you didn't erase that wall. The new people came, 2 new people came in, and you're like, hey, Bob and I were just talking about this. See the picture? Well, look at the picture. And then that picture might be on your wall for a week and a half or more as you kind of build on it through those conversations, right? And that's like, we don't have that kind of persistence in these, like we're on Zoom or Teams or whatever, for a half an hour, and then it's gone, right? And yes, we have Google Docs or whatever that have that persistence, but it's just not interactive enough. So I'm sure people at Zoom are trying to figure that out. And then we're all going to try and figure out, how do we draw with our fingertips on our mouse pad or whatever.
it's gonna be, I think the two core problems is how do you still do staff drawing, right? So everyone we need to get touch screens or something like that. Even I've used several touch screens and they're getting better, but they're still not quite the same as drawing. And then how do you persist that? You know, I always in my office, there's always diagrams up on the walls, right? And now with the tools, you don't have that stuff up on the wall. And even if you were to print some diagrams up and put them on the wall, you don't get the thing where people walk in and say, "Oh, what's that?" Right? It's hard on the video screen. So I think that's some of the problems unless we start having more and more screens at home with certain things written up on that. But I think that's one of the problems we see with collaboration. And you and I came from very different places, right? You've been at Sonatype, what, 7 years? You know, I was at the company 1 week, so it was certainly entertaining for me. Learning new people. You know, it was interesting because you know, video in my company has died a lot. You know, a lot of people just jump on audio calls. And so hiring has been difficult. It's you know, just hiring people and not seeing their body language really in real time as you get in person. So it's certainly been interesting. So what's been your biggest struggle when being remote?
I really think it is that collaboration that we have within the organization and what we were just talking about. And I think the other thing is, you know, also just that personal connection in the office. Like one of the things that I'd love to do is not just get back to the office to my whiteboard, but get back to the office to take my team to Taco Bamba and sit around and have some tacos and have some drinks and have that kind of just personal relationship building that you get in the organization. And, you know, just as you're a new employee, you know, we have 40 job recs open and you know, 40 job recs opened in January to hire more people into the organization. And there's a bunch of new people I'm meeting on Zoom, just as you were, you know, 11 months ago, right? And you're trying to make this connection and have them understand like who you are, what's the history of this place, who influences. And I think there's also some part of, you know, that we talked about the thing on the whiteboard. Well, right now my 10 meetings are scheduled out for the day. I know exactly who I'm meeting with, and no one else can kind of come and intersect that. But there's a point where I'm meeting with Alexis on my team, and Melissa from my team happens to come in like, "Hey, by the way, do you need that thing?" And she sees whatever on the whiteboard. She's like, "Oh, are you guys talking about that? Let me tell you A and B," right? Like I need to make sure that you have that input, and that kind of just instantaneous, you know, collaboration that just happens because you happen to be in the office, or you happen to see, like, I walked into the conference room after you were using it. You didn't erase the whiteboard, but I saw that strategy kind of mapped out. I was like, oh, that's happening. Yeah. Or we're partnering with them. That happened. We're missing that kind of spontaneous information sharing that happens at the office, where nothing is spontaneous at the moment. All of our schedules are planned out.
Yeah, and I see that, you know, with conferences, right? And you run all day DevOps, which is absolutely huge. I've presented at that. It's been great. It's actually, you know, great kind of because you can jump in and out of the presentations. But also what I like doing is actually showing up in person, right? There's that nice thing of the accidental water cooler conversation or browsing by the vendors to see what the different vendors are doing. And you just seem to miss some of that with an online conference. So do you think the conferences are actually going to get back and people will actually start traveling again? Or do you think it'll be remote or some kind of combination?
Yeah. So take this from a guy that runs one of the what used to be the largest virtual conference in the world, and now it's been eclipsed by some of the things that have happened in the last year. But one of the largest virtual conferences in the world, we're absolutely going, we're getting physical conferences back. There's no doubt in my mind that the physical conferences will happen again for that kind of connection and spontaneous connections that happen within the community. And many people that I've met that are in my own network, I've met and I'm good friends with, I met at physical conferences. Now we do a lot online now, but I think that, you know, the whole reason behind All Day DevOps, when we started it 5 years ago, we started as a virtual conference, and the key around it is still holds true today and will hold true when we go back to physical conferences, is at your organization, if there's a physical conference, Gartner's IT Expo or the RSA conference or DevOps Enterprise Summit as in-person conferences, you will send 2, 3, maybe at most 10 people if it's like a big investment for your organization. But there's 300 people that don't get to go to that experience. So what do you offer those 300 other people? And that's really the reason we set up All Day DevOps. Was we started with that vision that we could get more people from more organizations, more people within a single organization, and more people from different places that were just geographically prevented from going or didn't have the budget to go. All Day DevOps is free. But we also saw, you know, last year, an organization like State Farm, who I know sent 3 people to DevOps Enterprise Summit in their organization, because that's what they had budget for. That's what got approved, you know, through the organization, sent 4,000 people to All Day DevOps. Right. So when you can afford 3 people that, like, here's a top-notch industry conference that's great, those 3 people benefited and they'll share some trip report coming back that, you know, and that cost them something. It cost them time to participate in All Day DevOps, but they scaled from 3 people getting knowledge to 4,000 people getting knowledge. And I think organizations have figured out we can scale these experiences and opportunities virtually for people to give our employees a lot better experience working at State Farm. Like, they feel like they're making a corporate-wide initiative to move into DevOps practices. Well, how do you do that from a corporate-wide perspective? They got their HR teams involved, their learning and development teams, their whole executive team. And one, they did All Day DevOps with 4,000 people. They also did an internal IT leaders conference where they had 800 people, maybe 900 director level and above at State Farm participate in a virtual conference that we helped them organize as well. But that's how they're influencing their executive teams and directing their executives, as well as everyone in IT that could benefit. So I don't see that going away, because you go back to physical conferences, you're still going to send those 3 or 4 people. You're not going to say, wow, that All Day DevOps was so beneficial sending 4,000 people to this virtual conference. Let's get 4,000 employees on a plane to go to Vegas and have them do it in person, you know, for real. Not going to happen. But the desire for it is going to stay.
Yeah, I always remember, you know, it's always a combination. You always have so much budget, and it's always a discussion around, okay, who are we going to send to this conference versus that conference? You know, some people
They got to go
up.
last year. Bob got to go last year, so let's send Sue this year, right?
Yeah. So anyway, any last thoughts about digital transformation and software supply chain management?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, in the IT industry, like, digital transformation is going to continue. I think the cool thing and the challenging thing about digital transformation is how many waves of things are happening at the same time that can benefit us as an organization, and trying to find ways to stay on top of that. That's really the challenge of what's happening here. So I remember one of our board members and a very, very successful venture capitalist, Ann Winblad, she had given a presentation actually at All Day DevOps a number of years ago, and she talked about, when she started as a venture capitalist in the 70s, specifically in software, she was looking at waves of things happening. So, computers at the very beginning were starting as a wave, and then you have mainframes as a wave, and then you have microcomputers as a wave, and then you have PCs as a wave, and networks as a wave. And each one of those kind of had their cycle of 4 years or 6 years before the next thing came along. But if you look at the last decade in terms of the wave of open source being used in software development, AI, is AI and machine learning coming out, big data coming out as a wave, wireless communications that was a wave, collaboration that's a wave, virtual reality is a wave, right? You have all of these waves that are hitting the shore at the same time. The industry was kind of used to maneuvering in these kind of 4-year chunks, and now we're being, the shores are being hit with multiple waves coming in multiple industries fast. That enables us to innovate faster, but trying to stay on top of, these companies that went public this year, like Snowflake, right? Like that, like I don't use that. Someone uses it, but they're making, hundreds of millions and maybe billions of dollars on something like that someone somewhere is using, and that's just representative of another wave. And that wave hasn't hit my shore, but is hitting a lot of other shores. And that kind of,
there's a lot of industries that are like that. Financial services, especially where I work, right, with the underlying financial platforms, right, was really a sleepy place until a few years ago, and now I'm involved in real-time payments, which has kind of woken up the industry on a global level, because all of a sudden, right, there's now new ways and more efficient ways to send and receive payments, money. And so that's really, if you look underlying it, it's a combination of the open source, right, that's really helped fast track development, improve working capabilities, an improved way of doing software development. And so all of this is absolutely built on top. And now what you can start to look at is, okay, there's going to be some machine learning or AI getting applied on top. And then the data analysis just goes to the next level. So I think it's going to be applied to just about every industry. And I think that's where we'll see new products and new innovations coming out.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're about out of time, Derek. So I just want to say thanks. Really appreciate you jumping on this video podcast, and look forward to talking in the future. Okay,
cool. Thanks, Colin.